7.3 Citi FM. Relevant radio, always.
Great. So let's look at the challenges or the difficulties we are likely to encounter as in them taking over and some companies struggling to, in terms of labor or even pushing out some of the Ghanaian businesses because obviously they have heavier weights and etc. How are we dealing with that?
Well, I think, first of all, as I said, arming the Chinese business community with the reality that, yes, we do want strategic investments, but we expect that those investments will create jobs, will give us the opportunity for more ancillary jobs. Making that clear from the beginning is extremely important. And I think being able to demonstrate that there are a number of success stories, companies that have come in that have registered properly, that are compliant from an environmental perspective, which is why if you look at some of the processes around our approvals for licensing and permitting for strategic investor status, all of the different agencies, the EPA, the tax policy unit at the Ministry of Finance, the various permitting agencies within the GRA and customs, they all come together, work with us on reviewing applications. So just because an investor comes and says, we would like to invest 50 million US dollars and above, the money is not enough. We have to look at the environmental impact. We need to be sure that all of the permitting requirements have been met. We want to ensure that they are commercially viable, but if we want the investment to be sustainable, we have to ensure that it also has an economic input. And so I think making sure that the business community, both international and domestic, because let's also not forget that many times some international business players will have a tendency or be inclined to consider non-compliance only because they have a Ghanaian partner who has given them the impression that there are no repercussions. So sometimes it's not just the foreign company or the foreign investor who comes in thinking they can do what they want. Unfortunately, there have been several instances in various sectors where you have Ghanaians who don't support adherence to compliance. And so I think it's also a two-way street, making sure that we educate and arm our own business community with enough information. So as they are approaching people for business, they also understand, or we know the opportunities. We're interested in taking advantage of the opportunities, but we also know that this is what Ghana expects. And I don't think that we need to be reserved or shy as a country about speaking to that requirement for development. And I think we'll find the healthy balance as we continue to consolidate all of the different interventions that are required. So there'll be different controls, if you will. There'll be different systems and processes and procedures by which the international investor will find that, well, if I, for instance, want an immigration status, I will have to come through the GIPC because the Immigration Service and GIPC have a partnership and a collaboration. We communicate electronically. And so there is compliance on that score. If you're a Chinese investor, you already know that you have to register with the GIPC and you can't go and do anything that's non-compliant with the Immigration Service because of that partnership and that collaboration. I think that those working relationships are becoming stronger, as I said. And so when it comes to issues around companies taking advantage or international investors taking advantage, I've always said the law will evolve and more controls will come in place to suit our economic paradigm. So the question is not really whether or not there's corruption or whether or not people will do the wrong thing. Of course they will. But over time, as we have seen in other dispensations, the laws and the controls will become stronger and more robust. I'm sure no one will doubt the reality that we have one of the most prolific and vibrant parliaments within the sub-region. And there's constant discourse about ways in which we can reinforce and strengthen our legislation, and obviously the compliance that is required. So From an investment standpoint, we're interested in attracting the right sort of investor, but we make it clear what is required of you in terms of compliance, and obviously our monitoring function will also help to ensure that where there are difficulties, people can be set on the right path or handed over to the relevant authorities if they choose a path of non-compliance.
Great. Let's take the last one on compliance. And some indigenous companies are not happy with the GIPC over the controls of the foreign people in certain areas of business. For example, the retail and the markets and places they are not supposed to be. I know you've been firm and pushing that the right thing is done, but what would you say to those people about ensuring that places meant for Ghanaians, we don't see foreign businesses in?
Well, I mean, I think we've been very clear several times. We will always take the side of the law, and the law does not permit foreign entities to operate within our retail space. I think there are a number of administrative challenges, quite honestly, that we have to address to create additional clarity, because the issue has always been with what constitutes the market space, so that retail space. There are lists that have come from some of the ministries, there are some that have come from the metro assemblies. That clarity needs to be reinforced so that when it comes to compliance, it's easy to say, just because a Ghanaian is operating in this space doesn't necessarily make it a market. These are the areas that have been designated as retail spaces for Ghanaians exclusively. That's a challenge that we as Ghanaians will have to resolve. Having said that, I think that when you look at what we are trying to achieve by supporting the smaller and micro businesses to grow, develop, and support those smaller economies that are so fundamental to our economic growth, it's important that we also give them context so that they understand that we really are interested and engaged. So as a center, if we receive any queries, issues, concerns, we recently received some concerns that came from the Association of, I think, Fishing Gear Distributors.
At Cowley.
Yes, they had raised some issues and concerns. So immediately the monitoring team went out. We formally communicated back to them our findings. There were a few companies that we found were not compliant in terms of re-registration with the GIPC, but they had the right number of Ghanaians hired, the right number of expatriates that they had been allocated. The issue again was with whether or not the areas they were operating had actually been properly defined by the metro assemblies and backed up by our policy. So we have communicated back to them. These are our findings, and obviously shared that input with the Trade Ministry, who lead with oversight for a team of professionals or a task force that are regularly called upon to go out and investigate issues. Vivian, having said that, there is also the reality that we do have some Ghanaians who unfortunately will front for someone who is non-Ghanaian and operate in that space. And that's also an issue that we need to address with our business associations. I'm very confident that as the law continues to evolve, as I said, and as we as GIPC continue to look at our legislation that allows us to take more stringent measures against non-compliance of our legislation. So we've approached the Attorney General's office and asked for support to put in place some clauses that will allow us to prosecute for non-compliance in certain areas of our law. That will also support the domestic business community that have issues with the retail trade. But I will always maintain, and I think as a center, we've recognized it. It's a huge team effort. We really need the support of the retail industry to bring to our attention areas or issues of concern. But we also must make sure that there are areas that we can clearly state this is non-compliant with our legislation. And so perhaps coming together collectively with direction and support, perhaps from the Ministry of Trade and Industry, will come to a place where some of these issues will already be entrenched in the legislation and become a thing of the past. But clearly, the retail industry is one that I think will continue to thrive. We'll probably get the equation right when we're certain about what constitutes a market space. So that's a collective decision.
Great. So when do you intend to be done with the Attorney General bit and start biting?
Well, I mean, I think it's a process, obviously, and the Attorney General's office is going to communicate back to us some of the next steps we'll have to take. We're probably not looking at anything earlier than the first quarter of 2017 at best, because there's so much consultation that has to take place, and there are several issues that have to be clarified. Particularly with the Metropolitan Assembly, so that when action is being taken, it is action we can defend. It's also action that doesn't cause us to contravene various international trade agreements that we have signed up to as a country. So there are quite a number of things to take into consideration. But the legal team is working pretty hard around the clock to make sure that we can add a little bit more strength to what we do.